Welcome everyone to OpenInfra Summit 2023 in Vancouver. My name is Georg Link. I am here with a session on measuring open source community health with the help of CHAOSS metrics and software. I did not submit this talk by myself. I also had Sean and Precious, who are both members of the CHAOSS community. Unfortunately, they could not travel and be with us today. So I volunteered to have this session with you. And they are with us in spirit. And a lot of their knowledge I hope to convey as best as I can. For today, we have a few options. And I want to know what you would like to do. This is a space for us to talk about community health and metrics and software for all this. And I have slides that I can walk through and talk about. We can also have a conversation, or we can do a mix of those where I show a few things and then we see if anyone has something they want to add or ask questions and discuss. So how are you feeling? More interactive? I personally like interactive because we're finally getting back together in person and we can have these sessions be interactive. But if you are more in the mood for just listening, we can also do that.
Can you tell us a little bit about what CHAOSS is and what the CHAOSS Foundation is doing and what the metrics are first?
Absolutely, yes. So, and I have the talk structured in 3 sections where we can pause at any point. One is an introduction to the topic and introduction to CHAOSS. There's one section where I show some examples of how metrics have been used to understand the health of open source projects. And the third segment is on software and the process of getting the data and making it useful. So I'll just do that, run through a little bit faster so we have more time for conversation. Sounds like a plan? All right. So when we think about open source, this is a little bit to motivate why we are looking at community health. When we look at open source, at the core of it is that sharing and collaboration and using. And OpenInfra has the 4 opens that are really building the foundation for us to be able to do that. And we know that open source is very pervasive. It's in a lot of enterprise software. It has reached a level where there's more and more funding for it. And it also is drawing some unfortunate news, attention with vulnerabilities and bugs that are making really big headlines, because even though the project might be small, some of them are everywhere and they have a real big impact. I remember Log4j was only less than 2 years ago and kind of ruined everyone's Christmas. So we kind of care about open source because having these incidences is not good. So how do we prevent them? We want to understand our communities, and a healthy community is one that can take care of the software and hopefully have good, secure, strong software. Mozilla found in this framework that they published now 4 years ago already that there are different types of open source projects. And so when we start to look at open source projects, we need to take different lenses. We need to understand the background of what the project wants to accomplish. Is it an infrastructure project, or is it a big user interface, or is it a library? Is it projects by a company that just wants to make sure that all of their customers can look at the source code, but the governance is closed where they don't allow outside contributions? We need to understand all of this. And so when we want to use metrics to understand the health and sustainability of open source projects, we need to keep those things in mind. Now, I work at Bitergia. We have more than 15 years of experience doing this. We are maintainers of the open source GrimoireLab project, which is part of the CHAOSS project that we started 6 years ago now. And we're also official metrics partner here of the OpenInfra Foundation. So for every OpenInfra project, we have a dashboard about community metrics. So keep that in mind. We can talk about those as well. Now, I want to talk about the metrics and CHAOSS a little bit. So we understand now why it is important to look at community health. At least that was my motivation with the previous slides. CHAOSS is an open source project for us to get together and talk about how do we actually do this? How do we understand how a community is doing? And I personally think of a community needing 3 things. We need to have active community engagement. We need to be doing things in the community. We need to have the right resources and tools for collaborating, for testing, for everything that we need in our build process. And we need to have a strong quality code base. Without actually producing source code, what's the purpose of an open source software project? So those are the things that we thought about. And CHAOSS stands for Community Health Analytics Open Source Software. It's a project at the Linux Foundation where we gather best practices for different stakeholders. So there are many different people who want to understand how open source projects are doing. The contributors want to know, is this a good place for me to be in, especially when they're not already part of a community. It's often contributors come for the code and they stay for the community. But how do you know how a community is without actually being there? What are some indicators, some signals that we look at? And the communities want to see, okay, how are we doing in terms of getting new contributors, retaining them, where are the bottlenecks? The open source companies are also interested in understanding the health of projects, either because they released the software and they want to make sure there's a good community forming around it and they're reaching their business goals, or because they want to use an open source project and need to understand what is the risk. And I'll have another talk on this tomorrow on understanding the risk in open source projects that comes from communities. And then foundations like OpenInfra Foundation want to show here we're being good stewards, where do we need to invest resources, where do we need to make adjustments. So those are all people who want to understand the health of open source projects. And we got together and said, well, we need to improve that transparency. We need to level everyone up on how we talk about this, how we measure this, because there was no standard. Everyone was looking at number of commits, number of stars, number of people active in the project. But what does that actually tell us? And how does that translate to knowledge about the community? And what are the next level metrics and how do we get those? So those are the things we wanted to do. And so with the CHAOSS project, we started out with this mission of having a conversation about metrics. How do we implement them? How do we understand them? How do we look at communities? And actually building the software that gives us that data. And that is how we started. And then in the implementation process, we can learn about what the data is actually telling us, how people use it, so we can inform the definition of our metrics. That is the idea. The metrics we have are structured around risk, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm very happy that the OpenInfra Summit has a CHAOSS DEI badge, because one of the things around diversity, equity, and inclusion we found is the metrics are aspirational, but they're hard to collect, they're hard to show, people don't look at them, they're not asking for them, so how do we actually make it actionable? And we created a DEI badge where event organizers like OpenInfra could come and say, okay, here's what we're doing in all these areas with diverse speakers, with offering diversity access tickets, with providing a welcoming space, having a code of conduct. How do we show that? And you might have seen it printed out there. So those are all things that we say, okay, let's take a moment, reflect on it, and then as a way to show that you've done that work, we give you that badge. And so I'm very happy OpenInfra has taken that step. And we have, so going back to CHAOSS, we have different working groups that work through all of these things. This is how we do the work on defining the metrics. So there's one on risk, there's one on diversity, equity, inclusion, there's one on common metrics, and we also have some working groups that are like focusing on the website. If you're an open source, you understand we break out project into smaller sub-projects and groups of people working in different areas. So that's just on CHAOSS, giving you a background, and then we have two main software projects. One is Augur, and one is GrimoireLab. They both collect trace data about open source projects. They have different approaches to how they analyze and present the data, and we can talk about those differences as well. And CHAOSS also has geographically distributed chapters where we are in Africa, Asia Pacific. We're looking at expanding to Latin America and Eastern Europe. One of the things that we had, and for the last 3 years or so, we've had more than 70 different metrics defined. Number of commits, number of contributors, bus factor, and so on. And the feedback we got is, it's so difficult to know what should I be looking at. And so we started building out metric models where we say, okay, let's take 3 to 5 metrics, put them together that have a thematic relationship where we can understand the health of a project from a certain angle. And here you can see which metric models we already have defined. One is around collaboration, one is about development responsiveness, one is the DI event badge that I already talked about, one is around safety, one is around community activity, community service and support, project engagement, funding, project awareness, the starter project health, and community safety. And I'll introduce the last two to give you an idea of what a metric model looks like. These are prepackaged metrics that you can pick up to understand the health of an open source project. So the starter project health metric model has 4 metrics in it. One is time to first response. And this is important because the time when someone submits an issue or a pull request or merge request or a code change for review, how long does it take for them to get feedback from the community? That interaction is so critical, and we've seen in research time and time again, if people don't get that response, they lose interest in what they initially submitted, and then they leave the community, and they don't make the extra effort to come back. And their mind goes on, they're no longer concerned with this problem. So as an open source project, we want to capture that activity right there when people are ready to contribute. Change request closure ratio, so how many of our change requests are being accepted versus rejected, gives us an idea of how inclusive are we to accepting outside contributions, and also how well-defined is what we are doing with the project, so that we can say this is part of what we want to accept into the project and this is what we don't want to accept. It's also very critical to have a strong definition of what the project is about. Otherwise, it sprawls and it gets out of hand. Bus factor is good to understand how many people are at the core of the project. It's defined as the smallest number of people that make 50% of the contributions. And if we have one person that does more than half of the work in the project is likely at risk that if this person were to go away, a lot of knowledge is lost and a lot of activity, that the processes, there might not be someone else to pick it up. That can be mitigated by having the project at a foundation where there's more support around it than if it's an individual project just somewhere on the internet. And then release frequency. Having frequent updates, frequent releases, we've seen is important, especially when we look at security. How responsive is a project to be able to make updates? So this is one example. Here's another example, the community safety, where we want to acknowledge that coming to open source and putting ourselves out there has certain risks. And we want to provide a safe environment for everyone to do that, to be in this space and to feel welcomed and included. And so having those metrics here, psychological safety, having code of conducts, being mindful of our leadership structures and who is in leadership positions, are they representative of the people we want to see in our project? Also on the council, and burnout. Burnout is also something that we see a lot with maintainers who've taken on projects and they've become important, and then the maintainers kind of feel trapped that they need to continue to maintain this because there are other people depending on it, but they themselves might not even be using it anymore. I've done interviews with maintainers and the stories are quite interesting sometimes. So this is a good stopping point. I've now shared with you what the CHAOSS project is, how we go about defining community health and metrics for this. I've shared with you 2 models as examples. And so now is a good time where we can pause and have any thoughts, any questions, any comments that you may have, and have more of a dialogue. The next segment would be looking at examples. And then the third segment I have is on software. So a little foreshadowing. Yes, here is a microphone. And I believe we are recording this, so it's really important that we speak into the microphone, so it's on the recording.
I'm Stefan. Hi. I had a question to the previous slide. The time to react. Some question coming in my mind often, or let's say it now at the time of the summit, I don't have time to react on some pull request or so.
Yes.
But would it be fine if I say, okay, thanks for your contribution, we will have a look on it, and then the person see, okay, at least my request is heard. Would this help, or is it like okay, someone answered, but still I need to wait 1 or 2 weeks till actually something happens?
Yes. So, and I'm curious if anyone else has experience with this. From what I've seen and heard, and what the research that I've seen is that acknowledging the contribution, even if it's a bot that does that, and then says, hey, we typically get to this in 2 weeks, whether you do it personally or a bot, already helps set the expectations, and the person feels like, okay, this is being looked at, I know when to expect something, and then they can account for that. And they don't feel anxiety, okay, no one is looking at this, what did I do wrong, and all that is being eliminated by just setting that expectation. I'll look at it within the next 2 weeks.
Okay, thank you. My second question is to the next slide, to become more inclusive, because I'm working at an open source project which is pretty new, and was started by 2 companies in Germany, and all of the contributors are, or I think all of them are male and white persons.
Yeah.
Of course, right now we are quite small community, but the question is, do you have some tips how we can get more inclusive and say not only, okay, we want to have a bigger community, but also an inclusive community? Or maybe that's out of scope, but maybe you have an answer.
Yes, I have some thoughts on this. Again, this is an open conversation we can have where everyone can chime in. Thank you. So having two companies is already a good start. It's better than a single vendor project. And to make it more welcoming and inclusive, there are several things you can do even if you don't have the representation today. Simple steps: make sure there's a code of conduct, make sure you have a process for it. That is something I know people do look at, and there are people who choose not to be in a project that doesn't have it, or funding is not being made available to projects that don't have it. It's an easy enough thing to do and start with. There is something with implicit bias that we put into it, and this goes into research that shows people have different ways of solving problems and processing data and information and going about doing things with it. And men and women, statistically, on average, of course, it's a spectrum. Men have a tendency to be more, I'm going to just try it out. I find here's the first command. I'm going to see what happens before I read on. Whereas women, statistically, like to have, okay, this is the whole process. This is every step. This is what is going to happen, what I can expect. And then they start doing it. So having documentation that supports one or the other is exclusionary to the other way of working, approaching a project. And there is a process and gender mag, and I can give you the resources for putting yourselves into the shoes of someone who thinks differently, to look at the project, see, okay, if I want to make a change to the documentation, do I figure out what the steps are to do that, and to go through those exercises every now and then. So there are several things that you can do at different levels. There's a lot more suggestions, and I don't want to be the only one talking. If anyone else has direct response to that or other questions. And I think we still have
Thank you very much. I could understand the risk to use unfamiliar software, and also the CHAOSS estimate the software which is better to use, right? And I have a question about that. I believe the software, open source software is just a product, so it means that the demand is quite necessary to make the product. So it means that the software is also balance of the demand and supply. Mm-hmm. It means that the software is almost a supply. So it means that there is a customer to use the software. And in speaking of the software, especially with OSS, it's visible, the software is, but the customer is invisible who use it. And of course, the issue is revealed in the project. So the point is, I think the customer who use that software is quite necessary to estimate it has the future or the possibility to, mm-hmm. how can I say, develop or maintain.
Yes.
How about this issue?
Yeah. So we have. When we think of an open source project, and we can think of it as an onion with layers. At the core, we have the maintainers, the core contributors, and we have the regular community that is regularly active. We have episodic contributors, and then as we move out, we have users who might not be contributing, but they're still really important to the project, like you said, because they are key stakeholders who use the software, who have an opinion, who, if something breaks, will show up and tell you. Ideally, they tell you. So this outer layer is a challenge for us to capture, because a lot of the trace data we have in open source projects is on the contributions, on the commit, we know who made the commit, but they are contributors. If they are users, probably, but if they're users and who don't contribute, it's harder to know. There is an approach, or there are several approaches to understanding the size of the user community, and I can send you a blog post where we talk about all the different approaches that are available. One is you put a call home function in the software. Don't do that, please. You don't want to be caught in a firewall somewhere and then your software gets banned by the corporation. But it's a thought that developers have. Hey, if my software just sends a ping, hey, I'm being used here. Ethical way to do that is have an update feature where the software says, hey, may I please check if there's an update? And now your server registered, okay, this many installations are asking for updates. And people can opt out. Not every software has that level of interaction with the user. If it's a library hidden away in a code base somewhere, it's harder. Then you can, there are other approaches to that. One is to look at downloads. And downloads are an imperfect measure because you can have a CI/CD pipeline that pulls a new download on every build, and it doesn't tell you anything. But it shows you over time at least the trend. Is it going up? Is it going down? You also have user communities, Facebook, Reddit. Is there conversation about it? Stack Overflow. That's another measure you can use. And you can also look at, there's more in the blog post. I'm missing some out. But yes, it's important to know the size of the user community.
I got it. How estimate the user communities, the volume or such as that by the Stack Overflow or such as that. But yes, the point is that once the customer is ruined, removed, leaved, the product must be ruined, I believe.
Yeah. All right, I think we have about 5 more minutes or 3 more minutes. Do you want to see examples of metrics? Do you want to see software, more conversation? Examples? All right. So the first one, I want to show how organizational diversity as a metric can be used. And this is how many organizations are engaged. Like in your example, 2 starting out. In this project that I'm about to show, we also had 2, and we may hear more about it here at the conference. Kata containers. In this chart, we see the contributions colored in by the corporations or the companies that the contributors affiliate with. And we stack them over time, and I removed the founding organizations from this chart. And so we can see as the bars get taller, more and more contributions are made by the non-founding organizations. And we see the first bar just has 1 color, then 4 colors, and the number of colors keep going up as we move to the right. And we can see in this diagram how more and more organizations are actively contributing to the Kata container community. So this is one example. Drupal is looking at number of individuals contributing, number of organizations contributing. So where are these contributors coming from? And this is the last report that I found released. We see number of individuals dropping off, but number of organizations stayed almost the same. And so here we can see, because we have the same number of organizations, maybe they downsized a little bit during the pandemic, and the number of contributors they have dedicated towards Drupal went down. Once business picks back up after the pandemic, my personal hypothesis is that that number of contributors goes up again. And so seeing that organizations are still behind the project is good here. We have 1 more minute, so I'll give 1 more on global inclusive community. And here we want to think about time zones and languages and cultures. How do we accommodate that in community? And so WordPress, I found these numbers. just saying here's we have the project, the actual project translated to different projects, which is encouraging of the local communities there, and having these WordCamp events around the world in 48 countries. And so being able to show these metrics gives us an idea of how big the community is worldwide. I'm going to stop here because we are right at time. I'm happy to share these slides, connect afterwards. We also have a metric corner here in the OpenInfra marketplace where I will spend a lot of the time. This is a picture from last year. This year we are even closer to the coffee, so on your coffee break, feel free to stop by and say hi. And we have different sessions there on different communities and looking at their dashboards. So you're welcome to join us, and thank you so much for coming today.